So, when we talk about voice in poems, we often find ourselves thinking about the relationship between the voice of the poem and the subject matter of the poem. Sometimes, in thinking about the relationship between the voice of the poem and the subject matter of the poem, we find ourselves facing irony. So, I want to talk here about how sometimes the voice of the poem can be an ironic voice. And what does that mean? Well, we know that the basic meaning of irony is um, kind of a gap between what is said and what is meant. Not so much a gap as really an opposition between what is said and what is meant. A most obvious example would be, say you come to class late and I get irritated. So I say, thanks for being on time. So grammatically, what does that mean? Thank you for being on time. But rhetorically, it means the opposite. It means you're not on time and I'm angry at you. So that's basically how verbal irony works. There are many different kinds of irony I won't go into right now. Situational irony, dramatic irony, just to name two. But that's the basic form of irony, where there's a gap, an opposition between what is stated and what is intended. Now, a difficulty in thinking about irony in a poetic voice is this: does it seem that the speaker is aware that the speaker is being ironic? If so, that would suggest that this is an example of verbal irony. Again, a form of irony where generally the speaker is aware of the irony that's being produced. But what if the voice of the poem does not seem to be aware of the irony? Well, that would be an example of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony, of course, occurs when the readers have information that the speaker in a play, in a novel, in a poem does not have. If the most obvious or the most prominent, if the most prominent example of verbal irony probably in the English language is the opening sentence of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, then probably the most prominent example of dramatic irony in Western literature, as it used to be called, would be some of the lines of Oedipus and Oedipus Rex. So I'm going to paraphrase the first sentence of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. For some reason, I can never memorize the sentence perfectly. I've tried to for years. I usually read it out. But basically, the sentence goes like this: is a well-known fact that a man of good fortune will seek out a wife. Basically, the novel is about the opposite: how women without good fortune are seeking out men of fortune to make their husbands. So instead of wealthy men seeking out wives, the novel is kind of about the opposite. So the first line of that novel is verbally ironic. The narrator of the novel seems to be very much aware of the irony, the gap between what she's saying and what is expressed in the course of the story. Oedipus Rex, dramatic irony. Oedipus, who is responsible for the curse on Thebes because he killed his father and is sleeping with his mother, but does not know he is responsible for the curse on Thebes. It says things like, if the man responsible for the curse on Thebes, that's the city where he lives, if the man responsible for the curse on Thebes were standing right here beside me, I would punish him as he deserves. Of course, he doesn't know that he is the cause of the curse on Thebes, and it is a man standing very close to him. It is he that's in charge that causes the curse on Thebes. So that's verbal irony. So one challenge we'll have is trying to figure out when we're reading a voice that is ironic in a poem is Is this voice conscious of the irony that's being generated, or maybe the voice is not conscious of the irony being generated, and we know something that the speaker of the poem does not? So I want to look at a poem, a famous poem by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was a great ironist in his fiction and in his poetry. A man who was fairly skeptical about the possibility for happiness on this earth, but was very much aware of how we expect happiness, how we do everything we possibly can to find happiness, but how the world is constantly thwarting in the wildest, seemingly most random way possible our projects for happiness. Read Tess of the D'Urbervilles if you want to read a really great novel, but also one that's about this idea. It's almost like a cosmic irony for Hardy much of the time. The idea that the very universe itself is out to undercut our quests for happiness. But late in life, he turned to poetry, Hardy did, and he started publishing poems he had written a little earlier and also poems he was writing later in life. And a lot of them are rather bitter descriptions of romantic relationships. His marriage was not fantastic, so some of this may be autobiographical, some of this pain behind these poems where two people, a man and a woman, romantically involved, maybe married, are trying really hard to connect, but they just cannot connect. And Hardy generally uses irony as a way of exploring these undercuttings between expectation, I want to connect, and reality. It's not going to happen. So the poem I want to look at is a short poem called Neutral Tones. And it's a poem about a man and a woman standing by a pond on a winter day, and they are having trouble connecting with each other. Now, the thing to note is the poem is called Neutral Tones. And what does neutrality suggest? That something is neither good nor bad, that something is kind of without value. So we would expect then the poem to be about how the feelings between this man and this woman are neutral, that maybe the landscape itself in which they stand is neutral, that one of the problems in this poem is that everything is neutral, meaning not bad, that's okay, but not good either. There seems to be a kind of indifference, perhaps, in this landscape, if indeed the tones of the landscape are neutral, and if indeed the tones of this encounter between the man and the woman are neutral. Here's how the poem starts. We stood by a pond that winter day, and the sun was white, as though chidden of God, and a few leaves lay on the starving sod. They had fallen from an ash and were gray. All right, neutrality. The sun's white. It's winter. There is no color in the landscape. There are some leaves lying around, but they're gray. So gray is a neutral color. White is a neutral color. Winter in eradicating color from the landscape suggests a kind of neutral time of year. Grim opening. But notice that the poet says, a few leaves lay on the starving sod. So he's imbuing the landscape with a human need. Sod doesn't really starve. Humans do when they don't have enough food or they don't have enough love, we might say more figuratively. So it's like the speaker, this voice, is describing a neutral landscape, but he interjects his own feeling into this description that makes the landscape not neutral, but starving. Does that suggest that he is starving? Possibly. But the point is that if the poem is about neutrality, it also seems to be about, at least in this first stanza, about the poet not wanting neutrality, projecting onto the landscape a non-neutral feeling. Continues. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago. and some words played between us to and fro, on which lost the more by our love. This is a pretty heartbreaking poem. So the poet sees the eyes of his beloved, and what do they look like? Eyes that have been roving on tedious riddles from years ago, eyes that have been burdened by a past that has been uncomfortable. And their words playing back and forth. Oh, that's good. Maybe they're talking playfully. Maybe they're flirting. On which lost the more by our love. So the playfulness of the words, the playfulness is drained away by the love. So you see how irony is at play here, where these expectations. Oh, he's gonna describe her eyes and how beautiful they are. Oh no, they're eyes that rove on mysteries and riddles. Oh, he's gonna talk about how they're talking in a playful, flirtatious way. Oh no, their love actually drains away the playfulness. So there is that undercutting between expectation and reality. We see that. And again, this suggests, is this really a neutral experience or is it just a bad experience? But it seems like the poet is aware of the irony in this stanza. It seems like this veers toward verbal irony more than dramatic irony. Continuing, the smile on your mouth was the deadest thing alive enough to have strength to die, and a grin of bitterness swept thereby like an ominous bird a wing. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing alive enough to have strength to die, and a grin of bitterness swept thereby like an ominous bird a wing. And that syntax is twisted, isn't it? The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing alive enough to have strength to die. It's very hard to read that and make sense out of that. The language here, the syntax, is expressing the awkwardness of the experience, the difficulty of the experience. So again, there's a smile suggesting, oh, there's going to be a connection, but the smile is dead. Wait a minute, but it's alive. What's it alive enough to do? Alive enough to have strength to die. So it's like all these moments of like, oh, there's going to be love. Oh, no, there's not. This constant interplay between expectation and desire. But notice that neutrality is not here. There is bitterness here. There is more abundantity here. There is ominousness here. So again, we ask, is the speaker, even though he's thinking very negatively, is the negativity better than neutrality? In other words, does he want to describe a neutral tone? But his feelings of bitterness and pain and starvation, do they get in the way of his actual appreciation of a neutral landscape? Last stanza. Since then, so we realize this all takes place a long time ago, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped me. Your face and the God-cursed sun and a tree and a pond edged with grayish leaves. So the poem begins and ends with this neutral landscape, gray, white. But the interchange between the two is not neutral at all. Obviously, it's tragic. It's about the failure of love. It's about the expectation of connection between two people who want to be together, but their connection fails. So their relationship is not neutral. Perhaps the speaker would like it to be more neutral because it seems to be quite terrible. So we ask ourselves, is the speaker, is this voice aware of the irony of what he's saying? Or is he not? It seems like when he's describing the expectations he has for his love for this woman and how these expectations are undercut, it seems like that is verbal irony. Like he is very much aware that he's being ironic and describing this gap between what he wants and what he gets. But at the beginning of the poem, the end of the poem, we seem to be more in the area of dramatic irony. Because we have a speaker describing a neutral landscape, but then almost immediately imbuing this neutral landscape with non-neutral feelings of starvation and pain. And so this, we might say that this sort of not confusion, but this combination of dramatic irony and verbal irony is really part of what makes the poem so powerful, because it shows the speaker not really clear on his relationship to the subject matter. He seems to know it well enough to be ironic about it verbally in certain places, but in other places he doesn't seem to know what's going on in his own head. He doesn't seem to be aware of the fact that in trying to describe a neutral landscape, he's actually immediately making it a non-neutral landscape and projecting his negative feelings upon it. So this is just an example of how irony can function in a poem and lend the poem a kind of dramatization of thought that can be really moving, dynamic, and compelling.